Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. September 18th, 1999. The Krusty Krab is in a state of peril. If you didn't watch SpongeBob or have no idea where I'm going with this, I promise you, it will all make sense in about 30 seconds. The restaurant is losing business and seems to be dying. In an attempt to revive the restaurant, an idea is pitched for a talent show, where regular citizens in Bikini Bottom would go on and showcase their talents and their special abilities. For the most part, the show was a disaster. The audience was unhappy and upset, and as it turned out, no one there really had any talent. Every act was a flop, to the point where the only time the audience cheered was when the show was officially over. Why do I bring this up? Because it wouldn't shock me if the idea for that fantastic episode came from the NFL and from NBC's disaster one decade prior. Prior to Super Bowl XXIII, in an attempt to revive what seemed like dying ratings for a pregame show, NBC, I kid you not, decided that it would be a good idea to host a talent show with NFL players. No, I am not making that up. And the execution of said show was so bad, and not only did the show fail hard critically, but it flopped and did the exact opposite of what NBC wanted it to do. Nothing about this worked in the slightest bit, and it's not hard to see why. And this is the story behind one of the stupidest broadcast ideas in the history of the Super Bowl.
The bomb, the sack, the personal foul. Sunday football's toughest battle might happen before the game.
Before I talk about the show itself, we need some context to understand NBC's thought process behind the show, why they wanted to do this, and how they were going to go about it. As NBC was preparing to broadcast Super Bowl XXIII, their first Super Bowl in 3 years, they had one goal: get the ratings to the pregame show up. Over the past few years, the ratings for the pregame show had gone down. A Nielsen rating indicates what percentage of households with televisions are tuned into a program at any given time. At Super Bowl XX, the pregame show had a rating of 21, meaning quite simply that of every household in America that had a television set, 21% of them were turned on and tuned into the pregame show. But the number dipped at Super Bowl XXI to 18.1, and dipped even further at Super Bowl XXII to 14.3. NBC recognized this trend, and knew that they needed to do something different to try and stop the bleeding. With that, they came up with an idea, as brain dead as it was for reasons that will become very apparent later. To try and increase the ratings, NBC was going to air the Diet Pepsi Talent Challenge. How it would work was that one player on each of the 28 teams in the NFL would compete against each other in a talent competition, whether they were singing, dancing, doing stand-up comedy or impressions, playing an instrument, or anything else along those lines. You could already tell this was going to be a train wreck from the start when, instead of the 28 players competing, the field was cut down to 7. Eventually, the final field of 7 players was Detroit Lions running back Carl Bernard, Philadelphia Eagles defensive end Reggie White, Phoenix Cardinals linebacker E.J. Jr., Houston Oilers running back Spencer Tillman, Atlanta Falcons offensive lineman John Scully, Cincinnati Bengals wide receiver Mike Martin, and Los Angeles Rams wide receiver Michael Young. As for how the show would work, the show would be hosted by Ahmad, Rashad, and John Canty. Each of the players would perform in front of a live audience at the Miami Seaquarium. NBC was going all in on this idea, with one spokesman for NBC saying, "This won't be the Gong Show. What you'll see are football players with real talent." And NBC was so adamant about this idea that they asked the Cincinnati Bengals permission to allow them to use Mike Martin to participate. Yes, Martin was on injured reserve, but may I remind you, his team was playing in the game. NBC really thought that they had a winner on their hands with this idea. But as anyone with a brain could realize, especially when you consider the context surrounding the Super Bowl, this was a disaster waiting to happen.
Miami Seaquarium on beautiful Key Biscayne. It's the first annual Diet Pepsi Talent Challenge with your co-hosts, John Candy and Ahmad Rashad.
Before creating anything, the first question you have to ask yourself is a very simple one, and it seems very obvious. Who is this for? What is the intended audience that you're trying to reach and trying to grab onto? I do the same thing with my videos. There's some videos where the intended audience is a diehard football fan who wants to know more about a specific player. And there are some videos where the intended audience is much broader, because there's a chance the video could reach a wider audience that doesn't necessarily know a whole lot about the game. You do this with everything in life. Figure out the group that you're trying to get to. However, I'm not sure anyone at NBC asked this question, because there's a very obvious problem with this talent show. Because with this competition, it appeals to absolutely no one. I'm convinced no market research was done here whatsoever. There are two groups of people that watch the Super Bowl that you're trying to get to watch your pregame show. In incredibly broad and simplistic terms, you have football fans and non-football fans. Let's start with the football fans. They're watching a pregame show to learn about the game, to learn about the storylines, and to learn about the players competing. They're not here to watch a poor man's version of Star Search. They're here to watch football. Now obviously, I'm not saying that the entire pregame show should consist of football, because that would be unrealistic with how much time there is to fill, and because the goal of the Super Bowl for the networks is to capitalize on the phenomenon that is the game, and to capture the non-football audience. This is why you have the halftime show. This is why you have entertainers talk and make guest appearances during the pregame show, and this is why you have televised pregame concerts. Maybe the non-football fan has no interest learning about the game, but they hear that Debbie Gibson, Tiffany, or someone else that was big at the time is performing before the game, and they want to watch that. But here, why would non-football fans want to watch this? Outside of Reggie White, because he was one of the most famous football players in the country, and was probably the second most recognizable defender at the time outside of Lawrence Taylor, does the average American have any idea who any of these players are? Carl Bernard didn't even play in 1988. He was an undrafted player who played one season for the Detroit Lions in 1987 and picked up 187 yards. Not even the average football fan, and heck, not even the die-hard non-Lions football fan even knows who he is. Spencer Tillman was a running back for the Houston Oilers who played 2 seasons and recorded 15 touches for 34 total yards from scrimmage and scored 1 touchdown. Again, no one knows who he is. John Scully was an offensive lineman on the Atlanta Falcons with no accolades. Mike Martin was a wide receiver on the Cincinnati Bengals who scored 6 touchdowns in his 6-year career. And Michael Young was a wide receiver on the Los Angeles Rams who scored 4 touchdowns in his 4-year career. Outside of White, the average American had no idea who any of these people were. And outside of him and EJ Jr., not even the average football fan knew who any of these people were. It was the real-life equivalent of this scene from South Park where the kids, who are in the band Moop, decide to go on strike and stop playing music.
In a recent poll, we asked people if Moop's refusal to play would stop them from downloading music off the internet. 1% said yes, 2% said no, and 97% said, "Who the hell is Moop?"
That's exactly what this was. It would be the equivalent of if, in an effort to attract football fans to watch a television show, the entire episode revolved around the cast of that show playing football. There's no plotline. It's just 30 minutes of the cast playing football. You realize how stupid that sounds, right? The fans of the show are upset that you're not developing and progressing the story and the characters, and the football fans couldn't care less because they have no idea who any of these people are. Did NBC seriously think that someone would be watching this, yell out to a non-football fan not paying attention, "Hey, come here! Backup running back Spencer Tillman is on and he's doing impersonations," and expect a crowd of people to follow? This whole premise makes no sense whatsoever. And the sad and maybe even ironic part is that, yes, pregame shows are typically bloated with tons of filler content and tons of repetitive content. Every pregame show for the Super Bowl has at least one segment that's a dud or that's a stinker. When you're filling about 4 hours worth of content, and maybe even more, to talk about a game, that can happen. But this was the one year that they didn't need to do that. This was the one year where the stories wrote themselves, both from a football standpoint and a non-football general interest standpoint. This was the one year where you didn't need filler content, and where you easily could have filled an entire pregame show while appealing to both audiences. From an on-the-field standpoint to appeal to the football fan, besides the obvious matchup breakdowns and talks about the two teams and how they got to this point, you had the rematch angle from Super Bowl XXIII. You could have devoted an entire segment to that and the Super Bowl between those two teams that took place at the start of the decade, especially since Joe Montana was starting in both games. You had the last time the two teams met the year before in 1987, which was one of the craziest and stupidest endings to a game in the history of the NFL. I talked at length about that crazy game in a previous video of mine, so if you want to learn more about that, which I still maintain is the worst end-of-game coaching of all time, click the card in the upper right corner. However, in short, the Bengals had the ball and a 6-point lead with 6 seconds left, and on 4th down, instead of taking an intentional safety and kill the clock, decided to go for it, failed to get it, and then left Jerry Rice single covered on the final play to allow the Niners to score a walk-off touchdown. You could have done a deep dive into that game. You had the fact that Sam Wyche, the head coach of the Cincinnati Bengals, was an assistant for many years under Bill Walsh, and now you have the student playing the teacher for football's biggest trophy. You could have done a deep dive into the dance craze sweeping the nation with the Icky Shuffle, talking about the origins behind the dance, why it caught on, and even show celebrities and NBC personalities attempt to recreate it. And you had the lingering reports that this was going to be Bill Walsh's final game ever as a head coach, and that following the end of the Super Bowl, he was going to walk away from coaching and step down from his post. I talked about that process in a previous video of mine as well, So if you want to learn more about Walsh's eventual resignation, click the card in the upper right corner. Basically, this game was full of football storylines. And then you had the non-football storylines that appeal to the average American and deal with serious newsworthy issues. There were two of these in particular that come to mind. The night before the game, Bengals running back Stanley Wilson was caught doing cocaine, and not only was he left off the roster for the game, but he was subsequently banned from the NFL for life. This was during the height of the war on drugs, when cocaine usage was rampant throughout America, and especially throughout the NFL. Besides the obvious impact that Wilson's absence would have on the game, a serious thought-provoking segment could have been done on the effects of cocaine, how widespread this problem was, and what the NFL and the country can do to combat this issue. The other issue was the fact that it was somewhat of a minor miracle that this game was being held in Miami in the first place on its scheduled date. On January 16th, just 6 days before the Super Bowl, riots broke out all across Miami, and lasted all the way until January 21st, one day before Super Bowl Sunday. After a Hispanic police officer shot 2 unarmed black motorcyclists, Miami was in a state of chaos. Hundreds of people got arrested, stores were looted, multiple people died and were shot, roads were blocked off, and even one member of the Associated Press got beaten up and had his car torched. An NBA game between the Phoenix Suns and Miami Heat taking place in Miami Arena, close to where the bulk of the riots were taking place, was postponed. Miami was not safe, and Mayor Xavier Suarez said during the week, "For the sake of our city, I appeal to every citizen, regardless of race, to stay calm, get off the streets, and stay in your homes." It got so bad that the NFL was considering moving the game to Tampa because there was a genuine concern that the city was not safe enough to host the Super Bowl with the riots going on. As a side note, eventually that officer was found guilty of manslaughter. This was a national news issue that had a direct impact on the game. At times, it made the game feel somewhat insignificant. Sports and society have always mirrored each other, and never was that truer than prior to the Super Bowl. Between this and the cocaine issue, you had tons of national important stories that go beyond the sport and the scope of the game that you could have done an in-depth discussion on that the general American public would like to know about. But nope, we've got to show a talent show with your favorite third-string players. You realize how tone-deaf that looks, right? These issues were briefly mentioned, but when you're spending more time on a talent show than these issues that transcend the sport, it's a really bad look. You didn't see ABC at Super Bowl XXV gloss over the obvious impact that the Gulf War had on the game and the country. You didn't see Fox at Super Bowl XXXVI gloss over the obvious impact that the terrorist attacks on September 11th had on the game and the country. And you didn't see CBS at Super Bowl LV gloss over the obvious impact that the pandemic had on the game and the country. Yet you had NBC at Super Bowl XXIII decide that they were going to highlight this talent competition more than a race riots and more than the cocaine issue. It's incredible how awful NBC did when planning this out. And now we have to talk about the show itself. Because maybe, just maybe, all of this could have been avoided if the show was, actually good and made for quality television. Instead, it was not. Unfortunately, there is very little surviving footage of this show. You have no idea how badly I want to be able to watch it in its entirety, but very little footage exists more than 30 years later. However, we do have Reggie White's routine, which was his attempt at doing stand-up comedy. I'm going to play a brief snippet of his act, showing why it was a pretty good idea that White didn't wind up quitting his day job.
Thank you very much. How many of you hate waking up, when you were in high school or elementary school or whatever, you hated waking up going to school in the morning? Well, when I was a teenager, that's one thing I hated. I remember my mother used to come to me every morning. We know how mothers are, as sweet as they can be. And she used to come and say, "Reggie, baby, it's time to get up and go to school." And you wake up with stuff in your eyes, your breath smelling. Say, "Mama, Mama, I just don't feel like going to school this morning. Can I stay home, please?" She said, "Look, Reggie, son, you've missed 31 days out of school. Let's go, son. What's the matter with you? Some girl done broke your heart?" And I woke up and looked at my mom, got my leg ready. "Well, since my baby left me, I found me a new place to dwell. It was down at the end of Lonely Street at Heartbreak Hotel."
Guys, this act came in second place. According to the judges, this was the second best act that the entire show had to offer. Mike Martin wound up winning the competition. But this means that of all the televised acts, every other player minus Martin was worse. It was just boring television. And that's the worst thing you could have for a pregame segment. The last thing you want is something boring, unimpressive, and unfunny. And that's what this entire competition was. And the reviews for the show reflected that, and reflected just how painful this was. The Los Angeles Times called the show underwhelming, and said that the contestants were rough on the edges. The Washington Post, on the other hand, was way more scathing in its review. The show was a farce and was something that we, the viewing audience, were subjected to. NBC's effort was abysmal, and the Diet Pepsi Talent Challenge was the lowlight and was one of the worst productions in the history of network TV. As writer Norman Chad said, if this was the amateur contest on its showtime at the Apollo, the Sandman would have stopped it within moments, and he contested that maybe 7 or 8 viewers cared about the competition. But even that seems like a highball estimate. So that raises the all-important question. Did this work as intended? Did the ratings for the pregame show go up? Absolutely, positively, 100% not. I know, shocker, right? To the shock of no one with a brain who had any sense of foresight whatsoever, they tanked hard. Whereas the last time NBC held the Super Bowl back in 1986, the pregame show had a 21 rating, this one had a rating of just 13.3, which was the lowest rating ever for a pregame show, and was a full point worse than what ABC had the previous year at Super Bowl XXII. And the following year, when CBS hosted the Super Bowl, Mark Carlson, the director of sports information for the network, said on CBS's strategy to actually focus on football for their Super Bowl XXIV pregame show, CBS believes this is the culmination of the football season, that the fans want to watch football and learn about football and the game, and don't want to watch a talent show. That says it all right there. Now, some might argue that the reason the ratings were down had nothing to do with the content of the pregame show, or the fact that no one wanted to watch third stringers compete in the world's worst talent show, but rather because there was competition from other networks with counter-programming during the pregame show. Remember that the Super Bowl started at 5:17 p.m. on the East Coast, and at 2:30 p.m. over on CBS, in the only major televised event taking place during the pregame show, you had an incredible matchup on paper, a top 10 matchup in college basketball between number 4 ranked Louisville and number 10 ranked UNLV. Having said that, the game was a blowout and was atrocious. Louisville dominated and led 46-24 at the half. The game was over. So no, NBC could not use that as an excuse, especially since the ratings and the average viewing audience for the actual Super Bowl went up. The ratings were awful because this idea was awful and never had a shot at working. The show was bad. The execution was bad. The show was not designed for any audience in particular. And no, I'm not saying that pregame shows shouldn't do fun, entertainment-related things to attract a non-football audience, like concerts and interviews with celebrities. I'm just saying the best way to go about it is probably not by doing a horrible talent competition with third-string NFL players that no one, not even NFL fans, care about, and to have that dominate over actual news and serious issues surrounding the game that American society cares about. Because of all the stupid and tone-deaf ideas in the broadcast history of the Super Bowl, this one might be the worst of them all. Get your official Jaguar Gamer 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes, link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9, and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.